It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is the one and only John Bevere, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, X, Multiply Your God-Given Potential. John, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Shaun, it's a great honor to be with you, and I'm so grateful for what you've done for the kingdom and all your work down through the years, and I can't believe it's taken this long for us to get to know each other.
Well, John, I always say better late than never, and it's always funny. I always like to ask the author to tell a little bit of their origin story when they come on the show. Now, in the circles I work in, you are an author who needs no introduction. Most of us have read numerous books that you've written through the years, but inevitably there will be some person watching this or listening to this who says, I have no idea who this John Bevere guy even is. So for the man and woman meeting you for the first time, tell us what they absolutely must know about you.
Well, I mean, I'm in love with my wife, Lisa. We have 4 sons and we have 4 grandchildren. I'm 61 years old, but 30 years ago, God spoke to me and asked me to write. Actually didn't ask, told me to write. I laughed. I thought he had made a huge mistake because my worst subject in high school was English and creative writing and foreign language. And so I did nothing, absolutely nothing 30 years ago. And 10 months later, thank God, and I could almost tear up now talking about it. 2 women came to me from 2 different states in the United States, and they both had the exact same message. They said, John Bevere, if you don't write what God's given you to write, he'll give the message to somebody else, and one day you'll have to stand before him and give an account. Well, when the second woman said it 2 weeks after the first woman, one was from Florida, one was from Texas, the fear of God hit me, and I literally wrote a contract with God. I got a notebook, piece of paper. This is 1990, okay? And I said, contract. I said, God, I think you're making a huge mistake. You have much better writers. I don't know how, I can't write. I need your grace. And now the books are in the tens of millions. They're in 111 languages. And I'm just in awe of, if you would have said to me 31 years ago, the way God will send you to the nations of the world is through writing, I would have laughed you out of the room. And it's just like God to do that. So now it's really easy for me to look at these books, and you're being very kind in the words you spoke, but I realize my name's on these books because I was just the first guy to get to read them. I realize they're messages from him for his people to help strengthen them. And this one that we're going to talk about, Shaun, I am most excited about.
Well, and I have one more question related to writing, and I feel like you kind of stepped right into this one, so I'm going to ask it. You know, whether it's your first book, your 51st book, I feel like each writing experience, it's a journey. God challenges you, God shapes you, you emerge on the other side, somehow shifted or changed. So in terms of the time you spent putting X together, like how is John Bevere different on this side of that journey?
I have more of a father's heart and a passion to see people step into what God has created them to do, because Shaun, you know, we're one body. We have one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and we all should be our greatest cheerleaders. And I think it's even strengthened my heart to be a greater cheerleader for whether someone's in their 20s or someone's in their 80s, seeing them fulfill their God-given potential. And I know that sounds like a perfect answer for the book, but you know, I started writing it about a year ago. That's when God spoke to me, because I've never written a book unless God specifically spoke. And we're now at 22 books. And this one was so strong. And as I wrote it, I realized I just saw a lot of people engaging in what they're on this earth to do. And we all need help with that. That's probably the number one question I've gotten in 30 years of ministry. And so this John Bevere on the other side, I feel like I've got better answers for people when they say, John, I'm just so confused. What am I called to do? How am I supposed to make an impact? How can I, glorify Jesus in this life? I feel like this John Bevere on this side of this message has better answers now.
Well, one of the things I'll say, John, is in terms of the ideas you share in the book, I saw you connecting words and ideas in ways I'd never seen an author do before. Maybe I'm just not well enough read, but I think there's something special for what you put together here. And so I think where I'd like to go next is just ask you, if I walked up to 5 random people at church, and of course we'd be socially distanced and wearing our masks at this stage. But, if I asked them, hey, can you define faithfulness for me? I suspect I'd get some similar answers, but I'm going to guess that most of them would not connect faithfulness to multiplication. I would have never made that connection between those two. So how does multiplication give us the true definition of faithfulness? So how'd you make that connection?
So I remember the day it happened with me. I was just like you. I always saw faithfulness as being dependable, loyal, true, devoted, steadfast, consistent. And by the way, Shaun, I've spoken to leadership groups all over the world, and I'm not just talking ministry leadership groups. I've talked to NFL teams. I've talked to marketplace leadership. I've literally been in the business districts of Minneapolis. I remember speaking to corporate leaders, right? And I've asked them all over the world, give your definitions of multiplication, and I've never, ever heard one person say the word multiplication. And the way it became clear to me is if you look at the parable of the talents, Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven is like this. And he said, you know, it's like a man going on a long journey, and he calls his own servants. So we're not talking about outsiders. We're talking about people inside the kingdom. And he gives them different talents. Now, talent was a measure of money, but this is a parable. Those talents represent our unique gifts that are God-given. So mine would be writing. We've talked about it, right, on this program. I realize that what my ability to write is God-given. It is not something I naturally was born with. And every God-given gift, whether it looks natural or supernatural. I mean, right behind me hangs Akiana's portrait, the Prince of Peace. She did it when she was 8. That's obvious to everybody. That is a God-given talent, right? But you know, there are surgeons that remove tumors. There are dentists that take care of root canals. They have a God-given gift that is so valuable, and they don't realize how valuable it is. So let's get back to your original question. I realized this day that one of the primary definitions of faithful is multiplication. And that parable of the talent, Jesus makes it so clear. So he gives them their talents. He goes on this long journey. 2 of them multiply what was given. Okay? So one of them maintains what was given. When he comes back, he looks at the first 2 who multiplied their 5 into 10, their 2 into 4, and says, well done, good and faithful servant. That's not good enough for me yet. The next statement is what nails me. He says, you were faithful. Now, wait a minute. He didn't say at all in this parable they were dependable, reliable, consistent, faith. He didn't say they were kind, joyful. The only thing Jesus highlights that these guys do is either multiply what was entrusted to them or maintain what was entrusted to them. So he directly correlates being faithful to multiplication. You were faithful in a few things, I'll make you ruler over many. But the guy who maintains what's given to him, he is said, the master looks at him and says, you wicked and lazy servant. Now, lazy we get, wicked, whoa. That word wicked literally means possessing a serious fault. So in regard to his labor, he specifically possessed a serious fault that made him worthless in his fruit. That's the exact definition from the Greek English lexicon. So we would look at somebody that has a small business and they're making just enough to get by. They attend church when the doors are open. They're being faithful. Well, if you look at their labor in regard to the parable, no, they're not. He's being wicked and lazy. Now, hold on. He's got abilities. Let's talk more about this. He's got abilities to expand his market. He's got abilities to grow his business. But he's not, because why? He's living at a level that's comfortable to just take care of his wife and children. He's living at a level that maybe his parents lived at. Or maybe he hit a level that was where he thought he would be successful. I mean, my dream as a 30-year-old just starting to write was to just make the best-selling chart, right? Because I thought I'd reach a lot of people with the message. But then I saw the frustration of when I preached it, they only got one message, so I developed new curriculums, and then it went into 25,000 churches for the Beta Satan. But then the day came where God said, you have been faithful with the English-speaking community. So it was 10 years ago. We were in over 25,000 churches in America, over 1,000 churches in Australia, over 500 churches in England with all of our curriculums, 1.5 million curriculums. So we're talking Beta Satan, Undercover, Driven by Eternity, all these different books. And God specifically fills my basement. I mean, I wasn't even being so spiritual. I just got done playing a round of golf. I come in from the golf course. I go, Lisa's in England doing a women's conference. I read the book of Daniel, and the Spirit of God fills my basement. He said, son, you've been faithful with the English-speaking community. Well, what had I done? I had gone from, from a book to making curriculums, to making the message available as far and wide as possible by the gift of God on my life, right? He said, you've been faithful with the English-speaking community. I want you to now get your resources in the hands of every pastor in the world that can't afford them. Well, Shaun, that seemed like an impossibility, but I'm not going to go dumb for 9 months like Zacharias, John the Baptist's father, right? So now today, 10 years later, it literally looks possible, because in the last 10 years, by the grace of God, we've been able to give over, this seems almost like too surreal to be real, but we've given away over 41 million resources to pastors and leaders in 226 nations. That's all but 14 nations of the world in over 111 languages. I mean, and now we've just developed a $2 million app where just with the push of an iPhone, a pastor in Iran can send the Beta Satan curriculum and the Beta Satan book to every single person in his underground church for free in Farsi. And so now and that's launching next month in December. Now I'm really realizing that this can actually happen. So as a 61-year-old, I could have said, I'm an international bestseller. I've had all these royalties come in, but there's a drive inside of me that goes, no, I'm supposed to continue to multiply. And, here's the thing that makes me so sad, Shaun, and I'm sorry if I'm rambling on too long, but it's just pouring out of me right now. So I hope you'll give me grace for this, but let's just stop and think, what do you think? What I want to ask all your listeners, what do you think when somebody says, oh, he's got a call of God on his life. Oh, she's got a call of God on her life. Well, immediately we think of somebody that's called to the mission field, somebody that's going to be a worship leader, somebody's going to be a pastor, an evangelist. How sad, because only about 3, 4, 5% of the people end up doing that on a vocational level. Where does that leave the doctor? Where does that leave the businessman? Where does that leave the single mom who stays at home with her child, right? The fact is, every one of us have a call of God in our life. And to accomplish that calling, we have been given unique gifts. And those gifts are actually supernatural. They're God's abilities, just as my ability to write. So when you realize that you have unique giftings in your life, you will have the passion that Mother Teresa had, that Billy Graham had, that Oral Roberts had, because you will realize that you have been put in a sphere and you've been given gifts to impact that sphere, and that it's important. And I'm going to tell you one of the most tragic stories. I don't know if you read it in the book, but one of my friends, he does this massive conference, right? And he has a massive church. He has over 30,000 people in his church. Well, every year he does a leadership conference, right? And all these pastors flying from all over the country and around the world. And he was walking through his large auditorium, and he saw one of the medical doctors, who was a very well-known member of his church, putting pamphlets on each of the delegate seats. And my friend ran over and said, Doctor, you don't need to do this. We've got volunteers and we've got interns that are going to do this. And he said, the doctor rebuked him in a very polite way. He said, Pastor, I take 1 week a year off of my medical practice in order to build the kingdom of God. Don't take this away from me. It's my only week. And Shaun, my heart broke, because for 51 weeks of the year, that doctor is not building the kingdom in his own eyes, when in reality he is. And I think, how many single moms think that way? How many marketplace people think that way? How many people in education think that way? How many people in government think that way? In professional athletics think that way? They think that you and I are building the kingdom and they're just earning a living. So they have separated the sacred from the secular, and they only get sacred whenever they're in church an hour and a half a week, or when they're listening to a podcast like this. No, they're in the sacred 24/7. And when they realize that, they'll start, and this is what I love about this book, I believe it's going to build their faith. See, I couldn't write until I had faith to write. When God spoke to me and said, son, I've called you to write, I couldn't write. I mean, it would take me 4 hours to do a 2-page paper. But when I had the faith that I knew that God put that gift in my life. Now, all of a sudden, I'm fruitful. So how many people out there, because they don't have the faith, they don't even connect the dots of the fact that I'm in the arts, but I have a calling. I'm working on Broadway, but I have a calling. If they don't connect the dots, they're number one, not going to act on the supernatural, because the gifts in our life can only be activated by faith. And that gift, I mean, we have natural abilities that we can improve and all of that, but I'm talking about that divine given gift or gifts that God places in every child. They can't be activated unless it's done by faith. And that's what I'm hoping this book does, is number one, awaken everyone to their calling. And number two, give them the faith to activate their gifts to multiply. Sorry, I dominated this, but
that was great, John. I was about to lift my hands and say, preach, preach, preach. You were going along. That was really great. I think, John, though, you're touching on one of the big problems of this season, where people feel like if they're not on a stage or a platform, if they're not like the special, well-known person behind the pulpit, they've somehow failed in their calling. And I think what you said earlier is very true. We all have a calling. We all have a destiny. We have things that God has set in front of us that he designed exactly us to do. But God's calling you to be the Christian plumber out there serving your community. He's calling you to be the best executive or bank teller at the bank down the street. He's calling me to be the best executive in Christian publishing, to bring my gifts and talents to bear with the people I influence. And so really, once we begin to realize that we can bring the kingdom in all the places, the mountains, if we will, if we'll use that language that God's given us to climb and to take territory in, well, then that changes the game completely, because we are able to be Christ representatives and bring the kingdom everywhere we are all the time, not just at work, but at the grocery store and the gas station, and all the places where we touch other people's lives. Because if the only place we experience and we participate in Christian community is in the church on Sunday for maybe 90 minutes, that's a whole lot of time the rest of the week where we're not even stepping into our calling and what God's asked us to do. I mean, what a shame. I mean, that's a waste of a life.
You know, I have an engineering degree from Purdue University. So let's look at an airplane. Okay. An airplane has a project engineer who understands the overall project. He understands how everything works, right? That's Jesus. But let's say I'm a guy that's working on the fuselage. I mean, I can literally see the plane because the fuselage is a big part of it, right? So I get how I'm building this aircraft to carry people all over the world. But let's say that I'm a guy working on the INS system, internal navigation system, right? I'm sitting there looking at, just blueprint after blueprint of schematics of the electronics and the design of these circuit boards for this INS system. I'm never seeing this plane. I'm just focused on this. Well, let me tell you something. That INS system, if it's not working right, I'm going down. And the parts of the body, Paul says, that are not seen, you and I have a seen part. You're on here preaching the gospel on this podcast. You have millions of people listening to you. I stand on platforms all over the world. It's very obvious to people how our parts, because we're seeing the fuselage part. But that plumber is like an INS guy. And if you're sitting there trying to figure out how this whole kingdom's being built by you being faithful to that plumbing gift that God's given you and the gift of running that business, you're going to get frustrated if you don't see the overall picture and you don't go into this by faith. And so, because the plumber will sit there, I've actually seen plumbers that think, well, if I don't preach to every one of my customers today, I failed. Because that's the only way I can see of building the kingdom of God through my gift of plumbing. No, you might have just saved a minister or a mother a time from having a flooded house, and she could have been interceding that would have ended up, her intercessory prayers would have ended up causing 5,000 people to come to the Lord in Cambodia. So you're sitting there trying to put this whole thing together with your natural mind and natural sight, when in reality, it is a walk of faith. God, every single toilet I fixed, every single sink that I fixed today may save somebody the time that's going to end up impacting millions of people. God is the chief overall project engineer. And he didn't put you in an insignificant place because his word says that the parts that aren't seen are more valuable. We treat with more value, more honor than the parts that are seen.
John, I appreciate you using the analogy of the body. Know what part of the body you are and just embrace it wholeheartedly. One of the things I want to make sure we touch on before we run out of time is the idea of serving someone else's vision. I think especially for people as they're younger and they're up and coming and rising in the ranks, whether that's in the workplace, in the ministry, or wherever it is, the reality is I'm a Gen Xer. You're 20 years older than me. We got people younger than us who are up and coming. We are actually having people serve our visions, but we're also serving other people's visions. It just kind of depends where you are in the timeline. So talk to us a little bit about what does it look like to still multiply in our own work while we're serving others. Now my perspective is serving others actually allows us to build the calluses and get the shoulders that are ready to steward and carry what God's giving us down the road. And so we need to walk through that. But I know I've had younger team members and staff members who I've coached and managed where they're so frustrated because they want that big place at the table, but they don't realize they need to walk through these other things to be ready to carry what God has for them.
Well, look at Luke 16. Jesus said, if you're not faithful in that which is another man's, who will give you your own? Let's put our definition for faithful into that scripture. If you don't multiply what belongs to another man's, who will give you that which is your own to multiply? And I look at, all the people in the schools of the prophets. Did they have ministries? Yeah. But look at Elisha, who chose to wash Elijah's hands for 4 years. That word wash his hands means he just served his basic needs. And what he did is he gave Elijah the ability to multiply, right, in his work, because he took the menial tasks off of him. Well, Elisha ended up doing more than any of the guys in the schools of the prophets. So I look at my years that I served 2 men of God, and I served them in their ministries with all my heart for 7 years. Well, what did that do? That sowed seeds, and like you said, it gave me the calluses to be able to multiply. Those guys were multiplying in an amazing way. And I served them as if it was my own ministry. And I personally believe this is why God entrusted Lisa and I with the responsibility that we have today. I have watched people time and time again, they know there's a call in their life, but try to make it happen in their own ability. Try to meet the right people, get in the right green rooms, get in the right, and they're ignoring what they're supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be inputting data on the computer, right? But they're sitting there trying to manipulate and start something on the side when God didn't tell them to do that yet. It's a valid calling. I mean, Ishmael was birthed out of Abraham trying to help God bring to pass what God had promised him. And that's what we do. And when you birth an Ishmael, what you birth in the flesh, you're going to have to provide for it in the flesh. And I don't want a flesh ministry. I want a spirit ministry. I want a ministry that is born by the Spirit of God, because he'll provide for it in whatever I need. Whether it's, I watch, in my circles, young authors doing everything they can. They've written a book and they've pushed through and they're doing everything they can, and the books just don't explode. Why don't they? They're very disappointed. They have to deal with disappointment. Could it be that maybe they were supposed to be faithful a little bit more with that which was somebody else's? Could it be that they got out prematurely? I'm not trying to get anybody to feel bad, but I am saying that I made a commitment to my last pastor. I said to him, he said, I see a call on your life that you're going to travel and preach the gospel. I said, well, let me tell you my attitude. I am going to be your youth pastor. Now, this is back in the 80s. I said, I'm going to be your youth pastor until Jesus comes back for me, unless God tells both you and me that I'm supposed to do something else. And I remember the look on his face. And to be very honest with you, that was one of the wisest things that I said, not knowing it was wise. It was almost like I stumbled into that wisdom, because what happened was God gave my senior pastor, spoke to him about what Lisa and I are doing now. And he launched us, laid hands on us, and released us in what we were doing. And now, Shaun, we've had the privilege of reaching hundreds of millions of people. And that's not exaggerated, right? So What if I would have left prematurely? I have a gift on my life. I might have reached thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but I don't know if I would have reached the hundreds of millions that Lisa and I have had the privilege of reaching had we not waited to first be faithful in that which belonged to our pastors before we went out. And so, yeah, it's really important.
Well, John, it's almost time for us to wrap up. We've barely scratched the surface. You share a wealth of hard-earned wisdom throughout the book. So what's that one thing, that secret takeaway you hope every single reader discovers as they're mining the pages of this book?
Number one, they have a call on their life. Number two, they have unique gifts. And number three, they're going to discover those gifts, because I spend a lot of time on that towards the end of the book. And number four, they will have the faith to operate in those gifts. If they do that, then that means they're going to be extremely effective. And that's all I care about, because I don't want the body of Christ. I don't want 80% inoperative. I want to see a body that is 100% operating in its gifts.
And John, for the listeners, the viewers who'd like to connect with you, find out more about the book, where can we do that on the web?
Well, the easiest way to connect is johnbevere.com. And you spell Bevere just like severe, except it's a B like boy instead of a S. Or, they can get this book X on Amazon. They can go to Target. They can go to Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. They can go to any Christian bookstore, CBD. Or they can go to our website for our ministry, which is messengerinternational.org. But the simplest way, just johnbevere.com.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places you can connect with John and pick up your very own copy of his new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with John Bevere. Once again, our book today was X, Multiply Your God-Given Potential. For more on John and the book, a great place to start is his website. You can find that over at johnbevere.com. And John, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's been a real pleasure, Shaun, and thank you for what you're doing for all of us. We're so grateful.